I mean, I can tell you the story of how that picture came to be, but there is a picture of her in my office. Um,
Go ahead, I think it's important.
so,
What's it like looking at
okay,
that picture now?
so that picture hangs above my desk every day. So basically, I lost my only child to suicide 5 years ago.
Can a detective's dream solve a nearly 4-decade-long cold case? What happens when people who work for your safety and welfare are the ones who make your life miserable? And what choice is the jury left with when the killer confesses but does not remember the killing? These questions sound strange and fictional, but as some mysteries unfold over the decades, they are addressed in an absolutely real world. Today, we bring you 3 such cold cases which were solved in 2022 and will make you wonder, how can some events be this bizarre? Number 3. This is the case of 11-year-old Lora Ann Huizar, who was abducted, sexually assaulted, and brutally murdered. The girl's face haunted a detective for years, and the agent admitted with his teary eyes that he would see the little girl every time he closed his eyes during those years. On November 6, 1986, Lora disappeared while she was walking home from a gas station in St. Lucie County, Central Florida. 3 days after she went missing, on November 9th, her dead body was found in a drainage ditch. Her body was immediately sent for an autopsy, and asphyxiation was listed as the cause of death. She had been raped and later strangled to death. The authorities launched an investigation into the murder, but they could not find any physical evidence from the crime scene. The killer murdered the juvenile victim and later altered the crime scene by placing the victim in a drainage ditch in an attempt to destroy all the physical evidence. This move of the killer hinted towards his experience with dealing with crime and evidence. The police found traces of male DNA on Lora's body. The DNA was kept preserved in sexual assault kit, as there was no one to match the DNA with. Back then, DNA technology and the criminal database were not advanced enough to provide the authorities with any lead towards the killer. Lora's case eventually went cold in the files of the St. Lucie County Police Department. Nearly 4 decades later, Detective Paul Taylor with the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office reopened the case. I had already been through the crime scene photos, the case file, and what they're telling me does not match what I'm seeing, claimed Detective Paul. Taylor was able to reach out to the original witnesses who had originally spotted Lora. The questioning of the witnesses led him to a fact that it was one of their own deputies who had turned the witnesses away and later moved the body. After the initial point when they found her, a detective showed up. He sent them away from the scene, and the witnesses were never contacted by law enforcement again. In February 2022, Detective Taylor revealed that it was their own former sheriff's deputy, James Howard Harrison, who is now their prime and the only suspect in the killing of the 11-year-old. Harrison was also a church pastor and worked for 10 separate law enforcement agencies since the 1960s. It was Harrison who saw Lora alive for the last time. He abducted her on the way, raped her, and after killing her, he dumped her body in the ditch.
To determine that Harrison abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered the juvenile victim, and later altered the crime scene by placing the victim in a drainage ditch in an attempt to destroy physical evidence.
I am actually standing there in front of this victim's family, and I'm telling them that one of our deputies is the one who did it. It's rough, stated Detective Taylor. Investigators said Harrison had a pattern of inappropriate behavior with young women.
According to original witness reports, a uniformed patrol deputy, later confirmed to be Harrison, observed Huizar walking toward her home from a local gas station around the same time as her disappearance.
Unfortunately, Harrison was not alive for the authorities to charge him for murder and rape. He died of cancer in 2008, but the detectives got a warrant to exhume his body from the Oki'i Cemetery for a DNA sample. but by then, his DNA was too deteriorated to match with the sample found on Lora's body. Detective Taylor said that Harrison was forced to resign from the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office 5 months after the Lora Ann Huizar homicide, and also was forced to resign from his church because of his sexually inappropriate behavior with young adults. He had been previously accused of molesting children several times. For Lora's older brother, it was disbelief that his sister's killer was even finally revealed. It naturally was like a dream. After all this time, you're telling me you're able to tell us who murdered our little sister? Said her brother. The Huizar family said that they are so grateful to Detective Paul Taylor, who solved this case with immense determination, but they were frustrated with what they believed was a shoddy investigation at the time Lora was killed. From our perspective, things were purposefully overlooked and not done. There were such humongous gaps in the investigation, claimed the Huizar family. The police department now claims that they are now checking their own cold cases around the state because they believe there were other victims of Harrison. What do you guys think? Did the former deputy use his authority as a deputy sheriff and a standing as a preacher in the community to go ahead and violate children during the entire course of his life? How do we keep our women safe from these authoritative men who manipulate the laws and the system for their own evil desires? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Number 2. This is the story of 23-year-old Krista Bramlett from New Providence, Tennessee, who was found dead in her mobile home during the time when she struggled to find a roof over her head. It took 22 years to solve her murder. Krista Renee Bramlett was born in 1973 in California to Jim Langley and Kim Venable. She was known to be smart, caring, and funny. She was close to her family, but chose to be financially independent and lived alone. Krista and her mother had lived together in Clarksville until 1995, when Venable relocated to Texas with Krista's 2 children. Krista remained in Clarksville to complete her GED. Krista lived alone in Clarksville as she worked toward her high school equivalency so she could make a better life for her 2 young children. Her neighbors called her aloof, but her family called her warm and loving. On Monday, October 28th, 1996, Krista's landlord stopped by her mobile home to check on fire damage from the week before when a trash can caught fire. Instead of looking at smoke damage, he saw her shoeless body laying in the flickering glow of a small color television in the living room. "Then I called the police," Jeff Pennington, the landlord, stated. At the time of Krista's death, Clarksville police were investigating the killings of several women who had been killed in their homes. Police insisted that the killings were unrelated to this case. With Krista's death, the investigation started with the Clarksville Police Department Crime Scene Unit processing the scene and an autopsy by the Montgomery County Medical Examiner. The autopsy found Krista died by suffocation, and a rape kit found evidence of an assault. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation developed DNA evidence, which was filed with the Combined DNA Index System. Around 6 detectives started with the neighbors, interviewing between 50 to 60 people to find potential witnesses. One neighbor said she saw Krista on October 27, 1996, sitting on her stoop like she always did. But Krista gave an aloof air, and people usually left her alone. Within a week, police had received nearly dozens of tips, and they hoped to have an arrest soon. But the leads didn't go anywhere. There were no potential suspects found, and the years flew by without any arrest. The investigation resulted in more than 1,500 pages of documents. After 22 years, in February 2019, Clarksville police got the call they had been waiting so long for. There was a suspect in Arizona that matched the DNA from Krista's rape kit, 48-year-old Kenneth Hudspeth. Kenneth was an unknown to the police back in 1996, but they didn't suspect he could have had anything to do with Krista's death. CPD cold case detective Michael Ulrey stated that Hudspeth's name had never surfaced in the initial investigation. Ulrey interviewed Hudspeth, who admitted to being in Clarksville at the time of Krista's death, and to being in her home on the day of her death. Further, Hudspeth did not refute any of the facts of the case as presented to him. Hudspeth lived in the trailer park at the time and moved just after Krista's death in 1997. He had been arrested several times over the years, but his DNA wasn't successfully processed until 2019. Hudspeth was taken into custody on April 16th by Phoenix police and charged with criminal homicide. He will be extradited to Tennessee and booked into the Montgomery County Jail. He claimed he did drugs with Bramlett once before when he lived in the Sunnydale Mobile Home Park in Clarksville. Despite those claims, Bramlett's toxicology report came back clean with a low blood alcohol concentration level. When he was asked if he had sex with her, he first refused, but when shown the autopsy results and the DNA found inside Bramlett and on her bra, he claimed that he was so doped that he doesn't remember if he killed or had sex with Bramlett. "I was on bad dope. I know her. Did I have sex with her? I mean, I don't remember that," said Hudspeth in the courtroom. He further added, "I just don't see myself raping and killing this woman. I hope I didn't." Bramlett's family members were notified as soon as the break in the case was confirmed. "I knew all along that it was just a matter of time. There was never any doubt in our minds that they would find who had done it," said Krista's grandmother. In January 2022, 51-year-old Kenneth Hudspeth was found guilty and sentenced to life prison plus 20 years for the murder of Krista Bramlett. Number 1. This is the story of 9-year-old Darylyn Johnson, whose murder almost resulted in a false execution of an innocent man. The mystery of her death was considered solved for most of 2 decades, and then heart-wrenchingly re-emerged as a cold case in 2001. It was 8 a.m. on the morning of February 24th, 1982. Darylyn was walking 6 blocks from her home to the Lincoln Elementary School, but she never made it. A massive search for the Nampa girl ended 3 days later when a fisherman found her body next to the Snake River in rural Canyon County. An autopsy revealed that the child had been sexually assaulted and had suffered blunt force injuries to her torso and her head. The police also collected male hair and male DNA from the crime scene. In September 1982, 34-year-old Charles Fain was arrested for Darylyn's rape and murder. Mr. Fain was arrested on the basis of a hair sample, which he gave voluntarily to the police. And the fact that he lived a block away from the Johnson family added up to his arrest. After being arrested, Fain denied any involvement in Darylyn's murder. He even passed a polygraph test. But despite his denial and passing the test, he was charged with the murder of Darylyn Johnson. At his trial, prosecutors mentioned that a shoe print found near the body could have been Fain's. In addition, 2 jailhouse informants testified that they had heard Fain admit to committing the crime, and in exchange for his testimony, the 2 informants received a reduced jail sentence. Despite this buildup against him, Fain remained firm on his argument that he was innocent. He claimed that he was 100 miles away from the block when Darylyn was murdered. His testimony was corroborated by the other witnesses. Despite no solid evidence against Fain and no credible witnesses, the judge did not rule him out as a suspect. The results of his polygraph test were permitted as evidence in the court, and the DNA technology back then wasn't advanced enough to prove Fain's innocence. On November 4th, 1983, Fain was convicted, and in March 1984, he was sentenced to death. For nearly 2 decades, Fain was behind the bars in isolation. Then came 1991. He was just 4 days away from being executed, but surprisingly, his execution was pushed back. In 1999, when the DNA technology was a bit more advanced, it was admitted that hair and DNA found on Darylyn's body did not belong to Fain, but to an unknown man. He was then immediately exonerated. In August 1999, he was released from the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. Decades later, in 2019, investigators reopened the case, and in 2020, using genetic genealogy, they determined a 64-year-old suspect whose DNA matched with the sample found on the crime scene. The suspect was David Dalrymple. He was already serving a 20 to life prison for kidnapping and abusing a child in 2004. In January 2022, Dalrymple was formally charged with taking Darylyn's life. He now remains in prison, awaiting his probable another life sentence or the death penalty. On the other hand, Charles Fain is doing well and received a sum of $1.4 million for the wrongful conviction, and with that amount, he recently bought a truck for himself. We looked at 3 cases of women being assaulted, raped, and murdered. One by an authoritative man, another by a drugged man, and lastly, by a convicted criminal. These cases force us to think about efficiency in law enforcement and the safety of women all around the globe. Can women really be independent as they grow up and not worry about being killed or raped every second of their lives? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe to our channel for more such thought-provoking stories.